Hello there, my name's David Hurrian and I'd like to welcome you to this BBC Gardener's World magazine Masterclass online all about incredible edibles. So a little bit of housekeeping to start with, as we usually do, to make sure that you get the best reception from this masterclass, or if you're concerned about your internet connection, then please try and minimise all your other internet usage and just have this browser open, and that should enable you to see this masterclass clearly. If you do experience any problems during the class, then simply refresh your browser and that should enable you to rejoin. And if you do see a large button pop up at the centre of the screen during the beginnings of any of the video segments prompting you to play audio, then please select that button and that should enable you to see and hear the videos clearly. If for any reason you can't see or hear the video, or something goes completely wrong with your connection, then we will send you a link, an email link, to enable you to watch this video, a video recording of this webinar again, and that will be available for a certain period for you to be able to view. Now, the idea behind all of our masterclasses is to enable you to sit back and absorb the information, absorb the whole class and learn as we go. And it's been carefully designed and structured. So you may find that a question pings into your head, but that question might well be answered in some of the upcoming coverage. So bide your time, sit back and enjoy the presentation, and hopefully we'll answer all your questions. But there is also a Q&A, a question and answer section going to happen at the end of this presentation, where you get the opportunity to ask your questions. And if you do have any questions, then there's a section at the side of the main screen, to the right of the main screen of this viewing screen, that will enable you to type in your questions if you wish to ask them. If you can't see that Q&A section, then simply click on the chat symbol bottom right, and that will open up that whole section of the screen with the Q&A segment in it. Simply type your question into that Q&A section. The questions will be curated by a colleague of mine off screen, and then the most popular questions will be put up on screen, and then you will be able to vote for your favourite questions by clicking on the thumbs up symbol that will appear at the side of those questions. I'll then answer the most popular ones at the end of the session, when my colleague will join us and will put those questions to me. Do bear in mind though that while you're tapping away, typing in your question, you may miss some of the content. Don't forget there are also comprehensive notes to accompany this whole presentation and the masterclass. I'll give you information about how to access that at the end of the session. So without any more ado, let's get started on the presentation. So really the main reason that we want to try and grow crops in our own back garden, or even in the tiniest plot really, is manyfold really. People want to try and grow things to help keep them healthy, but also to help cut down on food miles. There are a whole raft of reasons why people want to start growing their own. But really it does depend very much on how much time you've got to spend growing them. There's no point in sowing and planting lots of crops and then not having the time going forward to keep them watered, fed and tended, and even harvesting the crops at the end of the day. So make sure that you're trying, if you're starting out growing your own, make sure that you don't go overboard to start with. Work out how much time you've got to spend and then gradually build up the crops that you're growing. Also choose things that you like to eat. For example, my sister, she's the only one in her family that actually likes carrots. So there's no point in her growing hundredweights of carrots and then not being able to eat them all. Crops also that are easy to grow, particularly if you are new to this business, crops that are easy to grow are the things that will give you encouragement. Again, there's no point in growing something that's quite tricky to grow if you're a beginner and then failing with it, and that might put you off. You also can choose things that give you the biggest harvest, and we'll come back to this a little bit later in the presentation. But if you choose things that give you reasonable big harvests, then you will actually help you to save money in the long term. You might also choose to grow things that are unusual or difficult to source in the supermarkets and shops. Unusual crops really are a cost premium as well very often, so growing unusual things will also help to save you money, and that's the watchword really as we face lots of financial constraints over the coming months and years. It's always a good idea to try and help to save money by growing your own. You could also grow crops that are not in the shops yet, so you could grow things seasonally before they're available in the shops. Nothing like making the first pickings of new potatoes, for example, or fresh raspberries as they come into season. Or you might choose to really test your skills by growing something particular. For example, if you want to try starting to grow citrus, you know, you might have an ambition to grow a lemon to put in your gin and tonic in the evening. So testing your skills to get lemons to grow successfully and to fruit, to get the tastiest lemons, you know, that might put a real test on your horticultural skills. And also grow your own, it gives you the opportunity to grow some seasonal treats, some one-off seasonal treats. Now seasonal growing really does make sense. Fruit, herbs and vegetables that are harvested at the correct time of year in this country as they're seasonally available, really those crops do taste so much better than crops that are imported from abroad and that have been stored and ripened perhaps in cold storage on the way during transport. The anticipation really of having things that are available seasonally is also really great. That, as I say, those first new potatoes or the first runner beans of the year or raspberries, anything that as it comes into seasonal always tastes so much better than the things that you eat regularly all year round. You just get blasé about them. So that anticipation of seasonal crops really does make all the difference. And picking them and eating them fresh also makes the difference. The sugars in harvested crops start to deteriorate as soon as you pick them from the parent plant. So picking them and eating them fresh means that they'll taste sweeter and the flavour will be much better. You also get the opportunity to know what goes into your crop when you grow your own, and obviously that's important if you want to grow organically, but also many of the crops that are transported from the farms where they're grown to the supermarkets may actually have coatings or treatments on the outside of them that you can avoid if you grow your own. For example, on the lemons I mentioned, you may find that you get waxed lemons and you won't have that if you grow your own lemon. It won't have any waxes on the outside of it. As I said before, it gives you the opportunity to cut down on your food miles by growing seasonally. Really, the impact of growing crops in various far-flung parts of the world and then transporting them to us at all times of year really does increase our food miles dramatically. So being patient, eating seasonally when it's available in this country or when you've grown it yourself really does make sense. The health benefits of grow your own are really important as well, and seasonally, if you can get out and start cultivating your crops as early as possible in the season, you'll get that really good aerobic exercise and maintain your flexibility by growing and tending crops throughout the growing season. And don't forget that some of the bumper harvests that you might get can be stored, either stored dry or in the ground, or you could freeze or bottle the crops as well. Now, it's really important that you ensure that you get the biggest and longest season of harvests from the crops that you choose to grow. So it's not really worthwhile, it may not be worth your while growing something that you just get one small harvest from and you haven't got space to grow an enormous quantity of it. And if you're waiting and waiting and waiting for this one tiny little harvest, then that can be really demoralising. So if you choose crops that will give you repeated pickings, for example, L'Oloroso lettuce, our multi-headed, multi-hearted lettuce, you can just pick the individual leaves from those lettuce and that will give you a long season of harvest rather than just one lettuce that's picked, eaten, and that's it. You know, it actually gives you a greater proportion of harvest if you choose multi-headed loose-leafed lettuce varieties, for example. You can also adapt your sowing dates, so by sowing some early seeds of particular crops and then after 7 to 10 days sowing another batch of the seeds, then you can get a continuity of crops. Sow these crops little and often and you'll get a long season of harvest from those crops as they develop. The same really comes from fruit varieties. There are so many different fruit varieties, apples, raspberries, strawberry varieties, all with different harvest periods, all with different seasons when they come into bearing. And that means that if you choose those varieties, some of the early, some of the mid-season and some of the late season varieties, then again you can spread out the pickings that you get from your fruit varieties. If you've got the opportunity to grow under cover, you can also extend the season and increase your harvests. You can also do early sowings under cover with specific varieties, with careful choice of specific varieties, early sowings under cover to get those early crops. For example, with potatoes, you can get early, second early and main season potatoes. And by planting them at different times, you'll get the crops spread out over a long season. Successional sowing, as I've also mentioned already, gives you that ability both indoors and outdoors to extend the season. And also choose things that give you repeat crops. Runner beans, for example, once they've grown up and covered their supports, they will then produce flowers throughout the whole summer that will produce a succession of beans on the vines that you can pick over a very long period. So try and find plants that give you a long season and will continually produce crops from those original plants wherever possible. And as I've already said, don't forget that if you get large crops or your main season crops, then you can store those big harvests to make the best use of them during the rest of the year. So we're now going to watch a video all about looking at the best place to grow edibles in your garden. Now, not everybody can have a big space like this in which to grow vegetables and fruit and herbs, a nice open area where they've got space to grow. But choosing the best place in your garden to grow your vegetables and your fruit and herbs is really crucial if you want to get good success. Now, the point about this place is that it's really good daylight all day. It actually gets direct sun when the sun's out, but even on a gloomy day it's pretty light and open. The sun actually rises over there. We're in the morning at the moment. It rises over in the east, progresses through the sky behind me to the south and pretty much above me at the height of summer, and then sets over in the west. So this place gets really good amounts of daylight, and of course that is really essential for good, quick, efficient crop growing. The thing that you might notice also though is that the tall wall behind me, which is north facing, that's casting deep shade at its base. And that shade in the winter months is quite long. It might extend right out to almost where I am. But in the summer, because the sun is so much higher in the sky, it's only just at the foot of that wall that the deepest shade is cast at midday. But surprisingly, first thing in the morning when the sun rises over in the east, particularly in the summer where it rises in the northeast of the sky, daylight gets in, direct sunlight gets into that wall, and also it gets in last thing at night when the sun is setting over in the northwest at the height of summer. That sunlight can shine into that wall. So a north-facing wall isn't necessarily a bad place, but in a smaller space where you might be overshadowed by walls, closer walls that are shadowing more into a small plot or onto a balcony, then you've got to really get that positioning just right so that you maximise the amount of light that the plants can get, and thus your results will be better. Now, if you have a very, very densely shaded place that doesn't get any direct sun at any time during the day, then it's worth probably just going with a few leafy vegetables. You might get away with some of the more common herbs, things like mint might just about survive. But for the best productivity, you need a good amount of daylight, and that equates to probably around a minimum of 4 to 6 hours of direct sunlight during the day. If you haven't got that, then it's worth seriously considering whether you do grow vegetables and fruit at all. Now, that wall that I mentioned along the back, that north-facing wall, is actually quite useful for crops that quite like cooler conditions. So you'd get away with rhubarb on there really well. The traditional crop for growing on a north-facing wall is the Morello cherry, the sour cherry. That will do really well on that wall. Also, pear trees do incredibly well without that maximum direct sunlight during the middle of summer. There are lots of opportunities as long as that north wall gets that first light in the morning and the last light in the evening. Now, you'll also see that I've got raised beds here. And the raised beds have been used because the soil here is very, very heavy under here, and raising the beds up means that you get a greater depth to cultivate. It's easier to get the crops growing in the first place. But raised beds are not essential for vegetable growing. It's perfectly acceptable to grow directly into the soil without the raised beds, as long as that soil is in reasonable condition. And we'll look later at what to fill those raised beds with, so that we get those best growing conditions for particular types of crop. But again, just because I've got them here, it doesn't mean that you have to grow in raised beds. Ordinary garden soil is just as good. And of course, if you've only got a balcony or a windowsill to grow your crops in, then big containers are really ideal. You can fill those with a soil and compost mix and get just as good a results from growing your own. So look carefully at your plot, track where the sun moves during the course of the day, choose somewhere that's really well lit, and you should have the maximum success. So it really is important to choose the right places in your plot to grow your vegetables and your fruit and herbs. Really choosing sunny, bright areas will give you the best results. But as I said, if you do have semi-shaded parts of the garden, don't despair, there are plenty of things that you can grow in slightly shaded spots as well. But also, when it comes to indoors, don't neglect growing spaces indoors. It might be that you haven't got very much room to grow outdoors, so don't neglect things like windowsills, particularly in the winter. Great places to grow small amounts of crops that will really add piquancy and flavour to your food, even to pre-bought foods, just dressing them up, zhuzhing them up a little bit with some microgreens that you might grow on a windowsill, some seed sprouts or some windowsill herbs. These are all easy to grow as long as you've got nice bright growing conditions and some warmth. Choosing what to grow in the garden also it's really important not to forget the really easy wins. Many of us think about grow your own as just being vegetables and perhaps herbs, but fruit and perennial crops take a lot of the effort out of growing your own. They're permanent things that will stay in the garden from year to year, and perennially, i.e. every year, they will come back, grow, flower and fruit, or just regrow and produce leafy crops for you to pick and harvest. They really are no-brainers to add to the garden. And particularly if you want a small tree for a garden or for a large container, then rather than choosing an ornamental tree or bush, it's worth going for fruiting plants, things that will provide you with a fruiting crop as well. So apples, pears, really easy to grow, permanently planted in the garden. They have beautiful spring blossoms and the added benefit of producing a crop. And the same with fruit bushes. They will have flowers early in the season and then produce hopefully bumper harvests. Gooseberries, for example, real no-brainer in my garden. I grow 3 or 4 gooseberry bushes in amongst the other parts of the garden, and they really do give me huge quantities of fruit to pick during the summer months. But also things like rhubarb. It's very easy to include a rhubarb plant even in an ornamental part of the garden, which will come back year after year and provide you with sticks of the stems or stalks, leaf stalks that you can harvest and use as a fruit. It is actually a perennial herbaceous vegetable rather than a fruiting plant, but it does actually provide you with a crop that you can use and enjoy. And also nuts, permanently planted cob nuts, for example, hazel trees in your garden, very, very ornamental, beautiful catkins early in the season, but you can also get a crop of nuts come September if you can get to them before the squirrels. And also you can permanently plant shrubby herbs in your garden. Really something like rosemary, one rosemary bush will provide you with massive amounts of rosemary, fresh rosemary to use in your cooking, but also to use as garnish. And the same goes for things like sage as well. Very easy to grow, no nonsense, easy to grow and bumper harvests. Now, many people will automatically think of raised beds as being the only way to grow crops, and I alluded to this in the previous video. I really think it's important that you don't automatically think that you have to grow things in raised beds. If you've got decent soil, then that soil in your plot, then that soil should be good enough to grow on the flat, just in normal ground conditions, on a level surface. You don't need to raise it up into raised beds. And there are pros and cons of raised beds. Obviously growing in a tall raised bed will actually bring the crops up to you. So if you have mobility issues, then you might create raised beds to make it easier for you to maintain your crops. Raised beds also do allow you to tailor your soil or your compost growing conditions to suit specific crops in your garden. For example, if you have a very limey soil and you want to grow blueberries, then growing in a raised bed filled with an ericaceous or a lime-free compost or soil will enable you to grow blueberries that you wouldn't be able to grow in the rest of the garden. Sometimes if you choose the compost and the soil mixture carefully, then raised beds can help to retain moisture at the roots, and you might choose to actually line the raised bed with polythene with holes punctured in it to allow excess to drain away, but that polythene will help to retain moisture in those raised beds that can be available for the plants to use. But also raised beds are really good if you've got no soil. So if you've got really, really bad soil, or you've only got paved areas outdoors to be able to grow in, then a raised bed can be built on the surface and then filled with a growing medium that will be you'll be able to grow something in. But there are plenty of downsides to raised beds, not least from the sustainability point of view. The growing medium can actually, what you're growing the plants in, that growing medium can dry out very, very quickly in the summer months. And because you're raised above the general surface layer of the soil, you may find that the water, any water you give to the plants, drains down and drains away very, very quickly, unless you line the raised bed. The compost level may also sink due to oxidization of that compost, and that's not necessarily a good thing. That helps to destroy the structure of the growing medium. And it's a really good idea, as I said in the video, to make sure that you add loam, a soil-based medium, so you've got mineral matter in that raised bed as well as organic matter. You may also find that the plants run out of nutrients pretty quickly in raised beds. And the raised beds themselves take up space, surprisingly, and the spacing of the raised beds, it may actually reduce your usable growing area, where you could actually cram a little bit more in if you were just growing on the level open ground. And if you don't line the raised beds, then you'll find that the tall sides of a raised bed can lift the crop roots away from the natural water table. So the plants aren't so self-sufficient. They can't root down into the natural groundwater and make use of that. So there are some cons, if you like, as well as a few pros for growing in raised beds. Where possible, it's really important that you grow crops in the ground, actually in the open ground, as we have done for millennia. Crops do much better if they can tap into moisture, as I said before, and nutrients that's naturally available in the soil. And it also makes them much more self-sufficient. It means you don't have to look after them quite so much if they can tap into their own reserves that they can use. Even paved areas, if you inherit a paved area, you might find that if you lift those paving slabs or any other type of paving, that underneath you've got soil that can be excavated, dug through, lifted and opened up and aerated with some organic matter added to it, and you'll be able to grow things in it. So don't despair if you've got no growing room. Do a little bit of investigation, and wherever possible try not to grow in raised beds or containers, because the plants will do much better in the open ground. So we're now going to watch a video about the soil and the composts for growing crops. Now, I've already mentioned that we've got raised beds here, and these have been filled with a certain type of growing medium to get the best out of the vegetables that we're going to grow. And that sounds a bit technical, but a growing medium is either a soil or a compost. And funnily enough, those two terms get separated out. So we think the best thing is to have a good quality compost. And sometimes soil can be considered to be pretty poor and not good enough for growing vegetables. But actually, it needs to be a balance between the mineral matter that's in the soil and also the organic matter that you usually find in a bagged compost. So that blend of mineral matter and organic matter, which is what bagged compost is generally composed of, is the real crucial thing. And that's what happens in nature. A good quality soil has that balance of mineral and organic matter in it. So we're trying to recreate that in whatever soil conditions that we're growing in, or even in a pot of compost. Even if we were growing out in the open garden, we would need to consider that quite carefully. We'd need to consider that we've got enough organic matter in the basic soil to keep it suitable for a whole range of different crops. Now, if you look carefully at this, these lumps that you see, these clods in the soil here, this is actually mainly composed of a slightly clayey mineral matter. And those clods are quite useful for actually holding on to moisture in the soil. So the temptation might be to knock all those clods down and get rid of them and make it really fine, and you'll find that the soil will dry out a lot quicker generally if you do that. So keep those clods, don't worry about them too much. Equally, don't fixate about stones that you find in the soil. Stones of about this sort of size actually are quite good in the soil because they trap moisture underneath themselves. So if they're on the surface of the soil, they help to stop water evaporating from the soil, help keep that water in the soil where the plants can use it, and it's much better all round. So as I say, don't fixate about smallish stones. They can be left in the soil quite comfortably. Now, it's also really important that you tailor the soil or the compost that you're growing your plants in, that you tailor it for each individual type of crop. So for example, root crops like carrots and parsnips, they really benefit from having an open, friable soil. That means that they can then get their roots down and they won't be interrupted, and you'll get nice straight roots that will grow a decent length. That can be achieved by mixing in some coarse sand into the soil to open it up, hold it open, and to allow those roots to permeate through. By contrast, leafy crops, things like cabbages and cauliflowers and lettuce, anything that you grow the crop for its leaves, that actually benefits from having a lot of organic matter in the soil. So it's worth putting some good organic matter, homemade garden compost or bagged compost into that soil because that will hold on to moisture and allow those leaves to get nice and succulent and big. And then the third type of crop that you can change the soil for are those podded crops or fruiting crops. So things like beans and peas, but also sweet corn and even outdoor tomatoes. They need moisture retention at the root. So again, they benefit from having that organic matter in the soil and full of potash. So it's worth thinking about the feeding for those particular crops, adding plenty of sulfate of potash to the soil in preparation for growing them. So get your soil in shape for the crops that you want to grow and you'll get the best results. So choosing the soil mixture to put into raised beds or into your open ground or into containers, really crucial to get that mixture of loam or proper soil mixed with good quality organic matter. Don't use exclusively organic matter composts because they do deteriorate. It's really important that you get some loam or some mineral matter in your soil. So, as I alluded to, it's really easy if you have raised beds or you have particular sections of your growing space that you can rotate around. You can move the crops from year to year around to different parts of the growing area. This allows you to be able to tailor the soil to suit particular types of crop. So at the beginning of the growing season, individual soil preparations and additions can be made to really tailor that soil, that growing medium, to get the best results. For example, leafy crops really benefit from good quality organic matter or even some well-rotted manure added to the soil or the growing medium, and also high nitrogen levels. So you might choose to put plenty of nitrogen onto that ground to encourage good quality leaves or top growth to be made. Root crops and onions, on the other hand, they can really enjoy open, free draining conditions. They like to be in nice, loose, open growing conditions so that they can grow without being interrupted. So adding coarse grit or gravel to the soil is really beneficial. Not so much to add organic matter to that soil for those types of crops. They don't really benefit in the same way as leafy crops would from the addition of organic matter, but certainly adding grit to that soil will really help, and also adding a little bit more phosphate to the soil or the growing medium will benefit those crops. And then podding crops and fruiting crops, things like beans and peas and also tomatoes and sweet corn, they really enjoy plenty of moisture at the roots so that they can grow strongly. So again, they need plenty of organic matter, but also they really do need potash. Potash is really fundamental for helping a good development of a good set of flowers and also a good set of fruit. So the compost itself, if you're going to grow in containers or raised beds, or even in the open ground, that compost that you would add to the soil is really fundamental for adding organic matter, that crucial organic matter to the soil or the growing medium to help grow. And that compost, wherever possible, should be sterile, reasonably free from weed seeds, which you don't want to be weeding for the rest of the season, so make sure that it's sterile and free from pests and diseases. It needs to be moisture retentive, and it's surprising that the addition of organic compost to the soil can help to improve drainage and help hold the growing medium open to allow good aeration to the roots, because plant roots need air as well as they need moisture during the growing season. Generally speaking, organic matter has low levels of nutrients in it to help you grow initially and to get crops started, but it might not have enough nutrient in it to supply the crops for the whole growing season. You can find composts to add to your plot, either homemade composts that you make from your own compost heap, or you can buy organic material composts in the forms of peat-free composts or even loam-based composts to add to your soil. So these are the ultimate, really, where loam-based composts, they already have the soil in them. They have that loam, that mineral matter in them that really helps to provide some substance and structure for the plants to grow in. Please try and use peat alternatives wherever possible. We really do need to cut down on our use of peat in horticulture. Still, we find that the cheapest bagged composts that are available at garden centres tend to be those peat-based composts. They tend to be the ones that you can find four for the price of 3 deals on. it's still the cheapest types of compost, but we really do need to cut out our use of peat wherever possible. And before you use that compost, particularly if you're going to grow in containers or you're going to sow into pots, pots of compost, it's really important that you sieve through that compost to make sure that you get rid of any large particles. Now, the benefits of adding organic matter or organic compost to the soil for growing are really so many, and I've actually enumerated all the things that are in this slide, all the different points that are in this slide in your handout notes. So I'm just going to go through this quite quickly, but this information is all in your handout notes. So as I've said, organic matter helps to keep the structure of the soil open. It retains moisture in the soil, crucial moisture in the soil, particularly for the dry summer months. Organic matter really is best applied to the surface of the soil or the surface of the ground to imitate nature as much as possible. The leaves which would fall onto the surface of the ground during the autumn decay and are helped to be mixed into the soil by the soil organisms. So imitating what happens in nature is really good. Try not to dig too much that compost into the ground. It's better to apply it as a surface mulch. Apply it in autumn or in spring, and if you've got plenty of that organic matter, then do both. Apply it in the autumn and the spring, and you'll really beef up your soil. Organic matter helps to intercept rainfall and hold on to that water as a sponge, meaning that you'll have less watering to do in the summer. And that fibrous layer of material on the surface of the ground helps to insulate the soil, stops it getting really cold in the winter, but also stops it getting really hot in the summer. And organic matter is absolutely crucial for feeding worms and other soil life that are actually fundamental to helping maintain healthy soil and to improving the fertility of your soil and cutting down on the amount of fertiliser that you'll need to add. Surface application of that organic matter also means that you smother weed seedlings and weed seeds, so you'll help cut down on all your work as well during the summer months. And that slow decomposition of that organic matter on the surface helps to release nutrients into the ground that are available then for your crops to take up. Now again, this whole pane, all the information that's on this particular slide is available in your handout notes. I'm not going to go through it in detail. Suffice it to say that there are many forms of organic matter: bulky organic manure, strawy bedding, spent mushroom compost, composted forestry and industrial wastes, as well as green waste composts from council recycling, for example. You may also find that there are still peat composts or peat soil improvers available. As I say, I would encourage you to try and avoid those, but those are very often sold as soil improvers. So beware that might contain quite large quantities of peat. But also making your own compost in the garden is absolutely crucial to having organic material that you can add to your growing plots, as well as leaves. I mean, autumn leaves really are often seen as a curse by many people, but I'm really keen to gather up as many of them as possible, compost them down and make wonderful leaf mould that is a great source of organic matter to add to the garden. Now we also then need to start to look at the conditions that we need for germination. So the permanent crops obviously can be planted into the ground and they will look after themselves, but many of the edible crops that we grow, many of the vegetables and some of the herbs that we grow will need to be sown from seed. And that seed will need 4 basic conditions to get good germination, and this is often overlooked. So we need moisture initially to actually help to soak the seeds, the dry seeds, to get them to start to swell in the first place. We also need warmth to encourage the seeds to start to split open and for the cells to divide inside the embryo plant that's inside every seed, even the tiniest seeds. We then need some air around that seed so that it can start to respire and use up the stored sugars inside that seed to encourage plant growth. and seed germination. And then ultimately we need light. So as soon as the seed germinates and pops out into the light, that light then enables that seed to start making its own food so it can grow successfully. So these 4 things are really important in that order. So first thing off, moisture in combination with warmth, then air. Don't flood seeds, because otherwise with water, thinking that they need plenty of water. They need an alternation between moisture and air to get good germination. And then lastly, they need light. Now, the times of the year to sow, again, we just need to go through this fairly quickly. It goes without saying that in the winter months, it's cold outside, but it's also very dark and we don't get good germination. Seeds will tend to germinate best as the soil starts to warm up. And you can see there's a graph of the soil depth. With increasing soil depth, you get warmer soil down to about a foot deep or 30 centimetres deep. The soil actually is quite warm in that surface. Right at the surface during the winter it can be very cold, but underneath that soil surface in that top 30 centimetres you can find that the soil is quite warm still, and that can encourage germination. And that will increase as we go into the spring, and then into the summer we get warmer conditions which will encourage better germination. But also it's the daylight. When we only get 8 hours of daylight during the winter and the early part of the spring, you won't get good reliable germination. As soon as we get to around 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night, then you start to get good germination, and that coincides with about March or April time. That is the time when you'll get the best, quickest germination for your vegetable crops in the spring. We also need to consider which crops need sowing indoors. Not everything needs to be sown under cover. Some plants can be sown directly out into the ground where they're going to grow. But if you're going to make early sowings to try and get some early crops in your garden, then those early sowings might need to be made indoors. And also things that need a long growing season may need to be sown indoors in around February or March time, brought on slowly and then planted out in the ground when we get to about May time, so later in the spring. Sowing indoors also helps to protect the seeds from predation by various things. For example, if you want to grow peas, if you sow peas directly in the ground, you may find that the mice and the voles come along and eat those pea seeds. So sowing them indoors, sowing them under protection, means that you can get those young plants growing and then plant them out to avoid them being eaten before they get a chance to germinate. And also tropical and subtropical crops, things like tomatoes and peppers, they need raising indoors in warm conditions before they can be planted out in the summer months. Again, this information is in your handout, and basically the indoor sowing can be done between February and May for a whole range of different crops that need sowing indoors, and the temperature regime for different crops will range between probably a lowest temperature of around 12 Celsius for some of the hardier crops, up to around 28 for the more tropical things. Things like callaloo, an unusual Caribbean leafy vegetable, for example, needs germinating at 28 degrees to get that successful germination. So there's a whole rundown of the things that you would need to sow indoors in your handout notes. And then outdoors, you can start sowing from around about late February, right the way through the season, through till around October. There are some hardy crops that can be sown right at the end of the growing season in September, October. They're tough enough to overwinter outdoors and then continue growing in the following season. And germination outdoors, the soil temperature needs to be at a minimum of around 8 Celsius up to around 18 Celsius. You might find the soil temperature during the summer might get up to 18 Celsius. Actually, outdoors, you may find some crops in the summer, things like lettuce, for example, in midsummer, the soil temperature may be too warm to get good germination of lettuce. So you might need to have a pause during the height of the summer when those temperatures are at their highest. But those are the temperature ranges that you'll find indoors and outdoors for sowing some of your crops. And as I say, all that detail is in your handout notes. The depth is really important. As a rule of thumb, the finer the seed, the more shallowly it needs to be sown or covered by soil or compost. Large seeds can be pushed down to around one or two times the depth of the size of the seed. So a big bean seed, for example, that might be around 1 centimetre across, that would go down around 2, perhaps even 3 centimetres deep in the soil. The larger the seed, the deeper it needs to be sown. So we're now going to watch a video about seed sowing in pots as well as directly into the ground. Now there are lots of seeds that you can sow to grow your own vegetables that you can sow directly out in the ground when it comes to warmer weather. But earlier in the year, or if you want to be sure about germination and getting things popping up and so that you're sure of getting little young plants to plant out, then it's a wise idea to actually sow into small pots or containers. So I'm just going to use 4 seeds, and these are really large, easy to handle seeds. So any seed like this, beans or courgettes or even sweet corn, push the seed just into the surface of the compost. Don't go down very deep. And with the courgettes, I'm just putting them on their side so that the water doesn't gather on the top of the seed and cause it to rot. Just pushing them in on their side vertically into the compost, probably going down about 4 or 5 millimetres, really not very deep into there at all, and then just sprinkle a little bit more compost on the top of that pot just to cover those seeds. Water it thoroughly, put it on a warm kitchen windowsill somewhere indoors. Those seeds will germinate in around about a week or so, if not less. And then I'm going to sow some small seeds into this very small seed tray. I've got these basil seeds here. I'm just going to show you how to sow these because these are a lot smaller than those big courgette seeds. And this same advice goes for any small seeds. Now if I sprinkle these into my hand, you'll see that they're not like dust, but you can see them, but they're almost the size of pinheads really. Take a pinch between your thumb and forefinger and then just roll your thumb and forefinger together and the seeds will sprinkle onto the surface of the compost. Another pinch to do this end of the compost. Just wipe the excess in, and as I say, that was around about 20 seeds. You don't need to be too fussy and measure them, but just don't use the whole packet. And then take a handful of compost between your fingers, between your hands rather, rub your hands together and you can see that the compost dribbles out between them. So just start rubbing your hands off to one side of the tray and then come over the surface of the tray backwards and forwards until you've covered those seeds up. Give it another tap, water it well, again put it in a kitchen windowsill. You could also use one of these little propagator covers just to cover that container up, just to maintain a bit of humidity around the surface, and again those will germinate in 7 to 10 days. So that's how to sow seeds indoors. Big ones individually, small ones sprinkling them on the surface and then covering them. We can also now see how to sow seeds out in the open garden. So when it comes to sowing outside in the open ground, we've got a couple of considerations really. The seed has to survive in the open ground and soak up moisture to start that germination process. It's no use trying to sow outdoors in the open ground in the cold weather of January or February, for example. So sowing by about May time, April, May time, is really reliable outside and you can expect the seedlings to germinate reliably and grow. And the benefit of growing directly in the ground is that the seedlings germinate, get their roots down and grow away without any disturbance whatsoever. So we've prepared this ground by forking through it and adding some organic matter and adding some sand depending on what we're going to grow in it. And then I use a piece of half cane to draw out a drill, go along the full length of the drill a few times to make sure that it's gone down deep enough. Take out the foil packet from inside you'll find that there's loads of seed again in here. They're often very generous. They give you loads and loads of seeds. And if I sprinkle those out into my hand, you can see that these carrots that I've got, and again, I'm not going to sow very many. You only want about 20 carrots maximum to harvest. So if you sow them all in one go, you'll get a complete glut of them. So again, fold the seed packet over again, take the pinch of seed between your thumb and forefinger and sprinkle it carefully down the row, just gently rolling your finger and thumb together and sprinkling the seed evenly down the seed drill. Now you won't really be able to see it, but just make sure that you keep your thumb and forefinger in the middle of the seed drill, and if you get to the end of the seed drill and you've still got some left, then make your way back. You won't be able to get them completely even at this stage, but it's worth doing that. Now once you've done that, it's a really good idea to then carefully dribble water along that seed drill, because that will not only wash the seed into the soil, don't make it too splashy, but you'll also moisten the soil around the seeds. And the first stage of germination is for water to be absorbed into that seed, and you're much more likely to get that water into the seed if you water along the seed drill after you've sown it. If you're worried about washing the seed out of the seed drill, then simply water the seed drill before you sow the seeds. Once you've done that, use your 2 fingers just to pull the soil back over that seed drill quite carefully. Just use a scissor action just to gently bring your fingers together, and you'll pull that soil over that seed drill and cover those seeds. They don't need to be very deep, but they do need to be covered. And then what I like to do is use the back of my hand just to gently lay it. Don't press it too hard, just gently lay it on the surface of the soil just to consolidate that soil around those seeds. Use a couple of bits of cane or something at the end of the seed drill just to mark where you've sown those so you don't forget them. You could also pop a label in there if you wanted to, and the sowing date. And make sowings of that sort of order every 7 to 10 days, and you'll get a continuation of carrots coming on really well. The other thing to do like that would be things like beetroot. You could also sow lettuce in exactly the same way. So that's a really useful tip to get good, quick germination when sowing direct into the ground outdoors. So you can see that there are subtly different techniques that you would use for sowing in pots compared to sowing in the open ground. But suffice it to say, don't think everything has to be sown in containers. As I say, some things can be sown direct into the ground where they'll do really, really well. Now, it's also worth just touching on this very briefly, that some things will benefit from being pre-chitted. That means pre-germinated a little bit. So things like cucurbits, things like melons, also cucumbers and courgettes and marrows. If you soak them on wet kitchen paper before you sow them, you'll find that they'll actually pre-germinate. And also things like peas and beans will really benefit from being soaked in water before you sow them, in the same way that you might pre-soak chickpeas before you use them in dried chickpeas before you use them in a recipe. So that will help to start getting the water into those seeds and start germination. But suffice it to say, it really only works for the larger seeds. Don't try it with the fine seeds because you'll just drown them. Once you've got the seeds germinated and growing off, you will need to think about weaning those young seedlings off the warm conditions and also hardening them off, ready to plant them out in the open garden. There's plenty of information about this on the Gardener's World website about weaning and hardening off your young plants, and also every week there is information about this in Gardener's World magazine. And suffice it to say that there are so many different things that you can use for your containers. We're all trying to be responsible and move away from growing things in plastics. Where possible, if you can sow in your own paper pots or recycled plastic vegetable containers that you might get from the supermarket, and also the insides of toilet rolls and other paper products. You'll find that that will help you to reduce your reliance on plastic. And if you do use plastics, make sure that they are robust plastics that can be reused and reused numerous times, so that you make the best use of them rather than throwaway products that would only go to landfill. So we're now going to watch our final video, which is a bit of fun really. It's about planting up a herb tower to enjoy this summer. Now, when it comes to growing edibles in containers, one of the best and most successful things that you can do is to grow herbs in pots, because herbs are really well suited to growing in extreme conditions, which means that they can be allowed to dry out and then re-wet. And as long as they're growing in quite sharp, free-drained compost, then you'll do really, really well. And the great thing about herbs is obviously that the more you pick them, the more they grow, and the more you have to use again. So really it's a win-win. And I grow a lot like these chives. I've been growing these in pots for a few years, but this pot has got a bit congested, and I really want to make the maximum use out of that growing space, or that footprint, that pot footprint if you like. And so over the last 10 years or so, I've sort of devised a way of growing herbs in what I call herb towers. So I've loosened all these chives already out of this pot, and I'm just going to take them out, scrape out half of the old compost from there. It's still in reasonable condition, it's got a decent structure. If you find that it's very dusty and dry, then just tip the whole lot out and start again. So I've come down to around half the pot's depth, and I'm just going to use that as the basis, a nice firm basis to stand my first pot in, that middle pot in. Just going to use a bit of fresh compost. This is a peat-free multi-purpose compost with some added John Innes, which is a loam material, and I'm just going to add perhaps one handful of grit to that. This is sharp, coarse grit. Just add that in there just to make sure that it doesn't get too wet and flood. You've got plenty of moisture capacity in the bottom of that pot, so just a little bit of extra drainage in that top layer. And then that's ready, hopefully, for me to be able to place my second layer in position like this, and then take some of the chives, and you can see that they've made really nice healthy clumps, these chives, and just rip through the middle of them. You get plenty of chives from one division. You can see how fibrous that root system is as well, and then simply tuck that root system into the layer between the two pots, and then fill in with some compost around it. So make sure you don't bury the plants too deeply. Make sure that you've got the stems, the top of the stems here is just level with the compost layer. As I say, don't bury them deeply. If you think that the chives are looking a bit tatty, there's nothing wrong with taking a pair of scissors to them and just trimming them back. So I'm just going to plant the first three so that we've got the general look. I can finish off the rest a little bit later. So that's my first layer gone in, just tucking that compost in around those plants at the base of the plants, just firming them in place. And then my next layer up, I've filled that pot with some good compost, again that fresh compost, and I've added 2 parts of compost to 1 part by volume of that coarse grit. Just lightly firm it in position so it's got something stable for that top pot to stand in place. And in this intermediate layer, I'm going to put this marjoram. You can be quite brutal with the root balls and flatten them out, if you like, between your hands so that you can poke them into that gap. Squash that flat and use one around the back here, and then make sure it's standing nice and firmly, and fill in with compost between the plants, just between the plants there, and again firm that in place and go round and finish those all the way around. And then I'm ready in my top layer for my pièce de résistance, if you like. So I've taken some compost and mixed it equal parts by volume with this coarse grit. So that's really nice and free draining for my thyme to go in the top pot here. So let's use a bit more of that in there. Take out a deep enough planting hole to pop your thyme in the top there. But there you've got your herb tower, and it's simply a matter of watering in the top here, and you'll find that the excess will drain away from the thyme, which likes it drier. It will drain into the marjoram layer, and the excess again will drain down into the bottom leafy layer where those plants need plenty more moisture. So it's a great way of providing the perfect conditions for each of these different types of herbs. So tailoring a herb tower will mean that you've got containers that will provide the best growing conditions to get the best out of each of those individual herbs. And you could actually use that technique to even grow some summer salads as well. You could grow some things that need drier conditions on the top pot and then have the more water hungry crops, things like salad leaves, lower down on that tower. So use that technique and adapt it to your own use. Now, when it comes to watering during the rest of the summer, it's really crucial that we make wise use of water. Now, again, these tips are all in your handout notes. It's important that you allow the crops to dry out between waterings because the plant's roots need air at their roots, surprisingly, as well as they need moisture. So don't totally saturate the roots of plants because you'll find that can stress the crops as well. And over soaking crops, giving them too much water and then leaving them to dry out completely, particularly with things like tomatoes, can cause the skins of the fruit to split, like the picture that's shown top left here. Continuous watering, as I say, can exclude air from the soil or the compost. So it's important that you get that alternating wetting and drying of the compost that will suck fresh air into the surface of the soil or the compost to be beneficial to the roots of plants. Erratic watering really is the thing that really does most crops a disservice. And if you're going away for a while and you need those crops to be maintained, try and find somebody who will come in and water them, particularly during hot, dry weather, because it can make all the difference between crops being successful or just dying, really. Really direct the water to the base of plants where it can soak down to the roots, where it can be used. Avoid sprinkling over the surface of crops like is shown bottom left here, that watering can, just sprinkling that water onto the leaves of those large sweet corn plants really is not going to do them any good whatsoever. Direct the water to the bottom of plants, and if it means sinking small flower pots into the soil or the compost around the base of the plants so that the water can actually soak in, it will really benefit the plants. Get that water down to the roots where they can use it. And the last tip really is to make sure that you apply water in the cool of the evening. Don't water at the height of midday in warm conditions, because you'll find a lot of the water will re-evaporate before it can be used by the plants. So water in the cool of the evening so that the water can soak down to the roots where it can be taken up. We also need to think about nutrition, and again these notes are in your handout. Which nutrients to give to which crops. So for example, we've already mentioned that nitrogen is beneficial to leafy crops, things like lettuce and cabbages, whereas phosphorus is needed for root crops. Most garden soils contain sufficient phosphorus for those root crops, so don't worry too much about those. And then potash is needed for podding and fruiting crops, things like beans and also tomatoes. So those big three, N, nitrogen, P, phosphate, and K, potash, those letters appear on the back of all fertiliser packaging, and you can work out which fertilisers contain which nutrients. But try and avoid anthropomorphizing your crops. Try to avoid thinking of them as human beings, because they don't need food. They are able to make their own food by capturing sunlight to make sugar. What they do need, however, is nutrients, those nutrients to use in conjunction with the food they make themselves so that they continue to grow healthily. Crop protection, really crucial. It's important that you net crops or go round and check your crops thoroughly, regularly to see the first signs of any infestation with aphids or whitefly, for example. Whilst those initial populations are building up, you can go in and pick those off by hand very quickly and easily, removing any insect eggs, for example, so that they don't hatch out and become an enormous infestation. Act early and you won't need to resort to chemical treatments. And also physical barriers, as I say, netting crops will also be really beneficial. So have a look on gardenersworld.com, plenty of information about crop protection on there, as well as in the magazine every month. Now, just lastly, let's quickly look at the crops that you might need to grow permanently under glass. So if you've got a glass house or a conservatory or a polytunnel where you can grow some of these things, then you can extend the range or repertoire of crops that you grow. And I would really recommend that you try and grow things like aubergines, cucumbers, peppers and chilies, okra, and some types of tomatoes. Obviously there are some outdoor tomatoes, but actually growing tomatoes under glass will give you better results. And also things like citrus crops, lemons and oranges you can grow under glass, where you'll get good results if you grow under glass. Many of these things are not hardy enough to grow outside. So think carefully about that. Also tomatoes, growing under glass gives you added protection. Not only gives you additional warmth, but it also gives you protection from blight disease, which is a big problem with outdoor tomatoes. So there we are, that's our presentation done and dusted. I'm sure many of you have got questions that you wish to ask. Have a look on the right hand side of your screen if you haven't done already, and look at the Q&A section and pose your questions by typing in your questions there, and my colleague will join us fairly shortly so that we can answer those questions. So let's get on with the Q&A live.